Hello and welcome to St Mark's Early Years Maths Workshop. I'm going to be talking through lots of different things that you can do with your children at home to help with their early maths. I'm just going to share with you the presentation. So the four main areas that we're going to look at are all about number, doing calculations, working with shapes, and learning to measure. So the first one we'll look at is all about number. So when we're talking about children learning about early number, there are a number of concepts that we're wanting to teach them. So first of all, children need to know the number names. So not even to recognize the numbers, but actually just to be able to say the number names. They need to know how to say them in the correct order. And then lastly, they need to be able to actually recognize the written numbers, the numerals. So what that means is when your child is learning very small, one of the first things they might do is learn how to say some number names. They might start saying even random names like 1, 5, 7, just out of sequence. That might be the first thing that a small child would do. And then after that, they might start to learn that they come in a particular order. So they might start saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And sometimes they say it very quickly, like they can't make a distinction between the numbers. So it could be like a string of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And they don't know actually that they can be broken into different words. As they get older, they'll start to understand that these numbers actually relate to, these number names actually relate to the written numbers. So they might start to recognize some familiar numbers, particularly perhaps the one that is their age. They might start to recognize number 3 or 4. And they might start to recognize numbers on buses or number on the door, those kinds of things. So next stage, the last stage really is just recognizing those numbers. And we work with children in nursery and reception to recognize the numbers, first of all, 1 to 5, and then we move on to 10. And then we might move beyond that. And some children are obviously interested in really big numbers, so we go with that interest as well. Okay, I'm going to show you some things now that you can do to help at home to support that. Okay, so you can use lots of number words with your child to label, not always count. So, for example, you might just say, look, there's 2 red cars, or I can see 5 ducks swimming in the pond. So you're just modeling using those number words. Starting counting from different numbers. So not always starting at number 1. I'll talk a bit more about that. And singing counting rhymes, lots and lots of number rhymes. Like this one, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, once I caught a fish alive. So just to recap, things you can do at home, using lots of number words, not always starting from number 1. So sometimes your child might be able to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and even beyond. But if you start at another number, for example, okay, let's start at 5, they might get confused because they don't actually know the numbers out of sequence. they can't start at a different point. They might have to go back to 1 in order to know what comes after 5. So starting at different numbers, and also counting backwards, because often we will count forward a lot more than we count backwards. So counting down, not just the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6 blast off what we might do, but counting down from any number again. This can be just a game that you play. And the last one, yeah, lots of nursery rhymes which have got numbers in. You can find all of these on YouTube if you don't know them. Just look for number rhymes, and there are many that you can sing with your child to help consolidate their understanding of number. Okay. Moving on to the next stage of number awareness. So your child has understood, they've got lots of counting words, and they know how to say recognize numbers as well. So the next thing we might move on to is actually the concept of counting. Let me show you. So when children are learning, what are they learning when we mean they're learning to count? Well, in order to count, as I said, they'll already need to know the number names in the correct order. They'll need to know how to say one number name for each item. So they need to know that when you're counting pens, you say 1, 2. And they'll need to have remembered how many they've counted, the last number name they said. So they have to remember, oh, yes, I had two pens. That's the last number that I said. So those are the key elements, which sounds very simple, but sometimes children will find that tricky, particularly it's called sort of one-to-one correspondence. So particularly, if you're counting objects with your child, encourage them to actually physically touch each object. That will help them to know that they've counted them. Other tricky aspects can be counting when things are arranged, not say in a line, but if things are just in a group and they're a bit all over the place, children might forget which they've counted and which they haven't counted. So you can also encourage your child to just say line things up. If you wanted to know how many teddies you had in a pile, line up the teddies, touch each teddy as you count and as you say the number name. That will help them. Other things you can do to help at home. Lots of different things you can do. So your child might enjoy already building with blocks, stacking blocks and making towers. So what you can do is encourage them to build the tallest tower they can build, and then to count how many blocks they can build with before the tower falls over. And then get them to see if they can beat their record. There's a picture here of a child who is laying the table. So you might get them to count how many people are going to have dinner. So how many spoons, how many forks, how many knives they need to count so that everybody has one. For baking, you might use, instead of using grams to measure the weight, you might use a kind of American method where they use cups or spoons. So that way the child, can count out, I need 4 spoons of sugar, I need 6 spoons of flour, and that will give counting a good context. It will give them a reason to count, which is very important. They'll see the point in learning that. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is recognizing numbers. So helping your child to recognize numbers. One thing that you can do for this is go on number walk, something that we do quite often at school. So you might go for a number walk inside, look at spotting numbers on clocks, calendars, maybe diaries, or you might go outside, looking at door numbers, looking at signs or registration numbers, bus numbers, bus timetables, going to the supermarket and see the prices and see if they can spot any numbers there. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section now, which is doing calculations. So let me show you that slide. So when children are learning to do calculations, what are they learning to do? Well, essentially they're learning to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And when I put multiply and divide together, it's because in the early years they are taught in a sense as together, as they are the reverse of each other. So first of all, adding. What are children learning to do when they add? Well, first of all, some young children might start to develop the ability to count objects just by looking at them. So as an adult, you don't always have to count how many apples there are. You might just look and say, oh, look, I've got 5 apples. For children, they might be able to do that with, say, 3 or 4 objects just by looking at them and know how many there are. They might also need to learn how to put 2 groups of objects together. So when you're counting, you're combining 2 groups of objects. And the next thing they're learning is how to count on. So let me just talk about those a little bit more. So when we talk about adding, putting 2 groups of objects together, you might do that, for example, in play with your child. You might have some red blocks and some yellow blocks and push those together and say, I wonder how many blocks we have all together, encouraging your child to count the total. The other skill we have is counting on. So I have 7 blocks and then I've just put 1 more here. How many do I have now? So it's essentially with that, it's learning that how to count on without going back to 0. So children might say, okay, I've got 3 pens. I've got 3 pens and I add 1 more. How many have I got now? So some children might recount them all, 1, 2, 3, 4. What you want to practice with your child, which is something that doesn't come straight away, is we know we've got 3 pens. We counted them, 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to add 1 more. What number comes after 3? And this is where knowing the number sequence and practicing counting from any number comes into useful, because if your child knows, okay, I'm starting at 3 and after 3 comes 4, they're going to find that a lot easier than if they're only used to starting to count at 1. Then they're going to have to go back to the beginning and go, hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than 3, 4. So that's quite an important skill to practice when you can in a playful way. Okay, so moving on to subtracting, taking away. Let's have a look. So what are children learning to do when they are subtracting, taking away? Well, they are physically removing objects from a group, counting how many are left. They're learning to count back, and they are learning to also compare 2 different groups of objects and decide which has more, which has less, and finding the difference. So I've got this example here with some conkers that children might have found. So it might be a child has found 1 group of conkers, another child's got another handful of conkers, and they might compare, who's got the most conkers, who's got the fewest conkers. And here this child has lined up his dinosaurs. So he is playing a game of taking away the dinosaurs. If he takes away one dinosaur, how many does he have left? So with subtraction, with taking away, again, the first skill that children will be doing, the initial skill, is going to be literally having a number of objects. I'll show you the pens again. Having a number of objects, knowing that you've got 4, I've got 4 pens, or there could be 4 dinosaurs, taking one away and counting how many are left. 1, 2, 3. That's the first skill that children will learn. As they get a little bit more confident, as they practice more, again, they might start to know how to count back. So they might know, okay, I've got 4 pens, I take one away, 1 less than 4 is 3. And they might just be able to work that out. Again, because they've been having lots of practice of counting backwards, of knowing the number sequence, of having that really in their head. So they don't have to recount. They don't have to go through that, that phase of take one away, 1, 2, 3. They just know that 1 less than 4 is 3. That's what we're aiming for. And lastly, there's the question of just comparing between 2 groups, which has more. So again, it might be, I've got some pens here and some pens here. Okay, which group has got more in? Okay, this one's got 1, 2, 3, 4. This one's got 1, 2. 4 is bigger than 2, so this has got more. So that's another skill they'll need to start to practice. Understanding, again, obviously, the number sequence, that 4 comes after 2, that 4 is bigger than 2. Right, lastly, let's look at multiplying and dividing and how we teach that in reception and nursery. So multiplying, we teach it as repeated addition. So for example, we might teach it as repeatedly adding in 2s. And we've got a picture of these socks here, because socks obviously coming in 2s. And we would be teaching the children to count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We might also use something very visual, like this egg box, which is laid out in 2s, and have them practicing filling the egg box, and again practicing counting in 2s. We might, with division, we often will teach it as sharing. So let me explain. We've got the apple here, so the apple has been cut in half. So we're showing that when we have a whole apple, 1, and we cut it in 2, we've got a half for somebody and a half for somebody else. So we try to do it in lots of practical ways. With division, for example, we might have a certain number of snacks on the snack table, and we would show division as sharing. We've got 5 apples, we've got 5 children, 1 for each child, and practice sharing that out. So it's very practical application. It's nothing at this stage. We're not expecting them to actually calculate. We're just expecting them to start to understand the concept of division as sharing and multiplication as adding repeatedly. Okay, so things that you can do to help at home. Board games are really great for counting because they are obviously helping your child to know the number sequence. They're also helping your child to understand how to recognize the number of dots on a dice, and to actually look at that and just know that arrangement of dots, there are 3 dots, that arrangement, there are 5. So if you remember me talking about children just recognizing a certain number without having to count, that will help them for that. And it's also going to help them to count on, because if they're on square number 10 and they have to count on, they roll a 3, they know that they've got to start at 10 and then 11, 12, 13. So they're practicing so many skills with that. And here we've got a picture of snakes and ladders, because that's just a typical children's board game. You can also play dominoes. Again, dominoes is really good for just getting your child to recognize without counting the spots, just like on a dice. Oh, 4 dots there, number 4. Oh, that's number 6. And again, just matching those up. Okay, we're going to move on now away from calculations onto shapes. So what do we want children to know about shape in the early years? Well, we teach them the names of shapes. That includes 2D flat shapes and 3D solid shapes. And we also, really importantly, teach them the way that shapes behave. For example, whether they roll, whether they stack, whether you can pack them together, whether you can fit them together. What that means is we want children to explore with shape. We don't want them to just know that that's a square or just know that that's a cylinder. We want them to understand what that means and how they can use them. And this is where construction comes in really, really useful for shape, because through children's exploration with building different models, they will understand a little more about how shapes work. For example, they'll realize that you can't stack balls, spheres. You can't really put a rolled cylinder on top of a cylinder, because it's just going to roll away. So they're going to naturally start to understand that using cubes, cuboids to stack is going to be more solid, and all sorts of other things through their play. And there's some really good words that you can use as an adult with them to help them to develop their shape vocabulary as they're playing. So all these words are words that we will teach your child, and you can use with them. So solid, hollow, same, different, cube, cuboid. So when they're playing with their blocks, you don't have to just say, oh, we're going to build with that block. You can name it. You can say, you want to use the cylinder block, or let's use a cuboid block. So they know the names. For 2D shapes, flat, corner, side, and all the names of the shapes as well. Some really simple things you can do to help at home. Jigsaws. Jigsaws really help for spatial awareness and for understanding how shapes fit together. And also just making shapes with the Play-Doh. So experimenting, manipulating the dough, rolling the dough, shaping it again to look at the different shapes that can be made. Also making shape collages. So you might use shapes cut from tissue paper, magazines, felt, sticky paper, and your child will enjoy just exploring and just making their own creation like this one. And then you can look at it together and you can tell them, oh, okay, I can see you used 2 circles, you used a square, you used 3 triangles. Look at this wavy line here. And your child might want to tell you themselves what they've used in their picture. Junk modeling is another fantastic way to explore shape. So save boxes, tubes, lids, and so on. You can also bring them to school, but we also collect them. So if you want to start your own collection, as you can see, this child has made a robot, and you can get so much out of that. And you might want to ask your child to, again, to explore. I wonder what will happen if if you turn that box sideways. I wonder what would happen if you put that box on top. So you're using so much mathematical language in that process. And of course, using wooden or plastic blocks. So many children enjoy playing with blocks, and I'm sure a lot of you have got them at home. Again, as they're building, just saying, you know, I like building with cubes. So again, using that word cube rather than block. They're good for constructing towers. So don't be afraid to use those words that seem very adult with your child, because they will start to use them themselves. Okay. The next thing within shape I'm going to talk about is position, direction, and movement. Positional language. So what can you do to help at home with positional language? Well, again, it's just about their child hearing you use those words. So you might say to them, what did you see when you crawled underneath the slide? Or, I saw you ride your bike very fast, past the slide and across the grass. So you're using those words under, across, very fast, that are describing their direction and their movement. And again, there are so many words that you can use to support your child developing their vocabulary in this area. Some words that I'm sure you use a lot anyway. So stop, start, follow, finish, end, under, over, next, in front of, behind, start from, to, along, above, inside, outside, between, forwards, and so on. And I have sent out a copy of these slides, but do ask me if you would like them again to have a record of that. Okay, and now we're going to move on to, again, shapes, but working more with pattern and symmetry. So a pattern essentially is always going to contain some kind of repeating element. So it might be that the color repeats, or the shape repeats, or the size. And all of those things that we explore with your child in early years. We also teach them that you can make patterns in different ways. So you can make patterns in music, in dance, in songs, like a clapping pattern or a jumping pattern. And lots of stories have got patterns too, like We're Going on a Bear Hunt has got a very repetitive, we're going on a bear hunt, we're going to catch a big one, I'm not scared. It goes over and it repeats the same words. Lots of different wrapping paper will have patterns, and you can spot patterns in so many things in nature. So leaves, flowers, and fruits. So what you might want to do with your child is draw attention to patterns when you see them. So if you are outside and your child is enjoying picking up leaves, look at the shape of them, fold them over and see how they are symmetrical when you fold them in half. Oh, look, it's the same on each side. Look at flowers in the different colors. Look at the patterns that you see perhaps on wallpaper, on wrapping paper, just drawing attention to that. And challenging your child to make a pattern. Like, I've made a pattern, my pattern is clap, clap, clap. Can you make a pattern? And you can make that as a game. Okay, we're going to move on to learning to measure. First of all, we're going to look at length. So what are children learning when they're measuring length? Well, they're learning that a piece of string is the same length whether you put it in a circle shape, a wavy line, or straight. So it doesn't matter how you manipulate that piece of string. It's still going to be the same length no matter how you stretch it out straight or you put it in a circle, it still remains the same length. They're also learning to use the words to describe and compare. So they might say something like, my brother is littler than me, because they have realized that they are they're taller or they're bigger. And we don't tend to measure using a ruler or a tape measure. As you can see this girl lying down, we've used handprints there to measure. So you can use all sorts of things. For example, if you want to measure how tall your child's tower is, you might think to use something like string. If it's laid down, you could use felt tip pens. You can use beans. You can use pennies. All sorts of non-standard measures, so that your child just starts to understand the concept of measuring. The one thing that is important is that you're using the same thing. So if, for example, if you say I'm going to measure with pens, that you make sure that they are all the same size, or that you don't start measuring with pens and then move over to measuring with sellotape. So you've got to keep a consistency for what you're using to measure. Okay, and now let's move on to learning to measure weight. So weight. What are children learning? So they're learning that, they might be learning that the size of an object doesn't always affect how much it weighs. They'll be learning to compare the weight of two things. They'll be learning how to use scales to weigh as well. So the first way that children, as in this picture, might learn how to weigh is literally by holding in their hands. They might have two items in their hands, and which feels heavier. So they are using their hands as scales. When they first start to explore weight, they might think that just because something is really big, it weighs more than something that's small. But obviously, something like a very small stone and a very big empty cardboard box, the stone's going to be much heavier even though it's smaller. So it's starting to experiment with that and to encourage your child to feel them in their hands and ask them, oh, is that heavy? How does that feel? Does that feel heavier than that one? Which feels heaviest? And as your child starts to develop their understanding of weight, you can start to use scales. And it's for them to also learn what happens. What does it mean when one side of the scale goes down and one goes up? To learn that the one that goes down is the heavier side, the one that's up is the lighter side. And you can make some really simple scales at home. I'll just show you. You can make some really simple scales using a coat hanger, a couple of little disposable cups there and some string. And then your child can really visually experiment putting different objects in each side of the scale and seeing which object is heavier by looking at which side goes down and which side goes up. And lots of words there that relate to weight that you can use with your child as well. Also, we look at learning to measure in terms of capacity. So this is where sand, water, and other kind of sensory play is really important, because it gives your child the chance to explore. So what are the children learning? They're learning that two containers can actually be different shapes and heights, but still perhaps have the same amount of liquid. Or you might have a very tall, slim bottle that holds a lot more than a short, fat one. So it's kind of experimenting with capacity and encouraging your child to pour perhaps one bottle into the other container to see, oh, is there more water or less water? And that's something that you can actually do at bath time. You can have a range of different containers, empty bottles, different shapes and sizes, and just experimenting how many of these cups, plastic cups, can fill this bottle. Oh, it takes 6 cups to fill this bottle? Or which bottle holds more water? How can we find out? And at school, we use lots of different materials like water sand, lentils, and different scoops to experiment, filling and emptying different sized containers. So yeah, that's just a picture of bath time. So yeah, collect different plastic bottles and containers to have a go at experimenting there. And you can use these words as well: full, empty, nearly full, funnel, container, small amount, large amount, holds more, holds less, count. And last of all, we're learning to measure with time. With early years, we're not teaching how to read the time, although children may have an interest in looking at the clock. They might start to recognize some numbers on the clock, and we would encourage that if they have an interest in it. But what we're mainly looking at is the ability for them to sequence events. For example, their own day. Here we've got a day to sequence. So at the beginning, you wake up, and then you perhaps go to school, and then you eat lunch, and then you have a bath. So it's all different sequencing of events across the day. And also the ability to sequence a story. So ways that you can do that is perhaps just talking to your child about their day, talking to them about events that you had together. So, oh, do you remember last week when we went and saw Grandma? Do you remember that tomorrow we're going to go to the park? So just using those time words. And also when you're reading a story, could be, what happened at the beginning of the story? Do you remember what happened next? And what happened at the end? So it's just getting them to understand that sequence of time and to use those words related to time as well. Lots of words here that you can use. So before, after, soon, next, long ago, day, night, minute, tomorrow, early, earlier. Lots of different words that you can use to help your child to develop their understanding of time. Okay. So that's the end of the presentation about early maths. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope that you learned something. Thank you very much, and I will hopefully see you soon.